A martial arts champion in search of the glow.
Master, I need more.
The sign outside says this here school is for instruction.
The Last Dragon was never a film that played by the rules. Released in the mid-1980s, a period when cinematic martial arts were still dominated by Asian archetypes or all-American muscle-bound heroes, the film emerged like an anomaly. Kung Fu mixed with hip-hop Motown, blended with Eastern philosophy, and a young black man searching for the glow in the heart of Harlem. It sounded like a joke, yet it was precisely that innocence that allowed The Last Dragon to endure far longer than many of its contemporaries. Yet behind that vibrant, humorous, and almost harmless exterior, there existed a darker layer rarely mentioned. In the background of a film that appeared carefree, decisions of cutting censorship and silence took place. Some things were not kept. Some moments never made it to the screen. And some questions were deliberately left unanswered. Did there truly exist a scene in The Last Dragon 1985 that no one was ever allowed to see a sequence erased from history just before the legend had a chance to fully take shape? When martial arts met Harlem, there was no map guiding The Last Dragon. This film was not born from a box office formula, nor did it emerge from a prevailing trend. It began with a very simple yet challenging question. Why had American cinema never had a black martial arts hero who was fully realized, untragedized, unfallen, and in no need of redemption? That question came from screenwriter Louis Vanosta. A man who grew up on kung fu films was obsessed with Bruce Lee, and yet also witnessed how noble martial ideals were almost always confined to Asian bodies, while black characters were either sidelined or pushed into the shadows of poverty and crime. Vanosta did not want to write another Hollywood-style story about overcoming adversity. He wanted to create a living myth, a protagonist who did not fight to escape his circumstances, but to perfect himself. Leroy Green, later known as Bruce Leroy, is not oppressed by society, not running from the past, and not burdened with psychological scars. He has only one obsession: becoming worthy of the martial way. This was a bold choice in the early 1980s, when black heroes on American screens were still commonly associated with street violence or formulaic comedy. Vanosta's greatest inspiration was Bruce Lee, not merely for kung fu, but for philosophy. Bruce Lee never viewed martial arts as a tool to defeat others. It was a path to understanding oneself. The Last Dragon inherited that spirit, but placed it in an unprecedented setting: Harlem. Noisy streets, fast food joints, old movie theaters, hip-hop cassette tapes, neon signs all became the backdrop for a martial arts story. Here, Kung Fu was no longer a distant legacy from the East. It collided head-on with African-American street culture with the rising rhythms of funk soul and hip-hop. That collision is what created The Last Dragon. The film does not attempt to purify martial arts, nor does it turn Harlem into an exotic stage. It allows two worlds to exist in parallel Eastern discipline on one side, American urban energy on the other. And Leroy stands in between a black young man wearing a Bruce Lee-style headband, speaking softly, bowing to his master, yet living amid Motown billboards and music blasting from every corner. The ideological core of the film lies in a concept that seems deceptively simple: the glow. On the surface, it is the golden light that emanates from Leroy's body when he reaches the pinnacle of martial arts mastery. But from the very beginning, Vanosta did not write the glow as a special effect. It is not magic, it is a symbol. The glow represents a mental state, the moment when body, will, and belief are in perfect harmony. That is why for most of the film, Leroy has no glow at all. He has only training, failure, patience, and an almost naive faith that if he follows the right path, the light will come on its own. Notably, The Last Dragon completely rejects the trope of the hero born from suffering. Leroy was not beaten, as a child did not witness a shattered family, and carries no vendetta that must be avenged. On the contrary, he grows up in a relatively ordinary family, with a brother, neighbors, and a community. His conflict does not come from society, but from his own doubt: is he worthy enough to move on to the next level? This is a very deliberate ideological choice, turning martial arts into an inner journey rather than a tool for resolving external conflict. That boldness made The Last Dragon a nonconformist film from the moment of its inception. It did not promise bloody violence, nor did it cheapen martial arts for laughs. It told an almost fairy tale-like story, but placed it firmly within an American reality. And precisely because of that, many viewers initially did not know how to receive it. Yet it was also for that reason that the film created a space entirely its own, where a black hero could exist without asking permission from any established mold. At the time, The Last Dragon was made. Taimak, the actor who played Leroy, was only 19 years old, nearly 190 meters tall, weighing around 85 kilograms, and a genuine martial artist rather than a formally trained actor. His inexperience in acting was not an accident. It fit the character perfectly. Leroy is not a hero who speaks eloquently. He is a hero who believes. He believes in his master in the martial way and in the glow. And that unironic faith became the ideological foundation of the entire film. The Last Dragon was not created to reflect a harsh reality. It was created to propose an alternative possibility. If a black young man could become a martial arts hero without sacrificing himself, what would that look like? The film's answer does not lie in a punch or a final knockout. It lies in a light that appears only when one is ready to believe that they are worthy of it. And from that ideological foundation, the legend of The Last Dragon began quietly, unusually, and unlike any martial arts film that came before it, the gamble called Taimak. No one in Hollywood in 1984 knew who Taimak was. No agent, no previous films, not a single meaningful line on an acting resume. The only things this 19-year-old had were a rigorously trained body, the discipline of the martial way, and an almost stubborn belief that he belonged on this path. In an industry where every leading role is weighed by name recognition and box office draw, placing the center of a film on the shoulders of an unknown, like Taimak, was a decision that ran counter to Hollywood's survival instinct. But The Last Dragon was never a safe project to begin with. And Bruce Leroy, a character who lives by belief, required someone who truly believed, not an actor merely playing belief. Taimak did not come to the film through a traditional casting process. He did not impress with dialogue. What made the filmmakers stop was the way he stood still. Nearly 190 meters tall, weighing around 85 kilograms, solidly built, yet unshowy with focused and calm eyes, Taimak carried the bearing of a real martial artist, not an actor pretending to be one. When he bowed, when he held his stance, when he trained in silence, every movement radiated something the camera needed no explanation for discipline. Director Michael Schultz and screenwriter Louis Van Osta understood clearly the risk they were facing. Taimak had never stood in front of a camera. He did not know how to act. But perhaps that was precisely the advantage. Bruce Leroy is not a talkative hero, not someone who inspires through speeches. He is a hero of persistence, of silence, of practice. And Taimak, in a very natural way, was the embodiment of that. The real gamble began once the cameras started rolling. A 19-year-old actor, inexperienced, carrying an entire film of over 100 minutes in a project that blended martial arts music and comedy, one small misstep, and everything could collapse. If Taimak failed, The Last Dragon would not just be a bad movie. It would become a textbook example of a familiar Hollywood saying, never put the lead role in the hands of an unknown. And for Taimak, that failure could mean an ending before he ever truly began. That pressure was never spoken aloud, but it was present every day on set. Taimak had no time to learn acting in the conventional sense. He learned by training more than anyone else. Martial arts were not a secondary element of the role, they were the primary language. The punches, the stances, the rhythm of breathing all had to look as if they had lived in his body for years. Because Bruce Leroy was not allowed to resemble an actor learning martial arts, he had to be someone who lived within the martial way. Strangely, Taimak's inexperience in acting became a layer of protection for the character. Leroy speaks slowly, his eyes slightly naive, his reactions sometimes stiff, but it is precisely this that sets him apart from the action heroes of that era. He does not try to look cool. He does not flaunt victory. He does not revel in violence. He feels more like someone seeking acceptance from himself than from the world around him. That was when the boundary between actor and character began to blur. Taimak was not acting someone searching for the glow. In many moments, it looked as if he himself was searching for it. The light of recognition of proving that he deserved to stand at the center of the story. And somehow the camera captured that. Taimak's gamble was not confined to box office results. It lay in a larger question. Could an unknown become an icon through belief and discipline alone? If the answer was no, Hollywood would quickly forget him. If yes, Bruce Leroy would no longer be just a fictional character. He would become a model for an entire generation of viewers who had never seen themselves reflected in martial arts cinema. When The Last Dragon reached theaters, Taimak had not yet become a star. But he had achieved something more important. He made audiences believe. Believe that Bruce Leroy was real. Believe that the glow was not a joke. Believe that a quiet, black young man, not overly sharp, could stand in the middle of Harlem and declare his devotion to the martial way without being ridiculed. For a 19-year-old actor with no experience, that was already a quiet victory. A film that belonged to no category. As The Last Dragon gradually took shape in the editing room, a problem became impossible to ignore. No one knew where to place the film. It was not traditional kung fu in the Asian mold, where the martial way is told through ascetic hardship and rigorous philosophy. But it was also not an American muscle-driven action film, where conflict is resolved through guns or raw violent punches. And despite the heavy presence of Motown music, The Last Dragon could not be called a musical in the conventional sense. It hovered between genres, a hybrid creature that Hollywood has never been particularly fond of. That in-betweenness was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it created a sense of freshness rarely seen in the mid-1980s. On the other, it turned the film into a headache for anyone responsible for marketing or distribution. When a film cannot be labeled, it cannot clearly promise audiences what they are about to see. And Hollywood, accustomed to selling a sense of safety, is deeply wary of things that cannot be summed up in a single line. That risk grew even larger with the presence of a villain like Shonuff. Julius Carry entered the frame, not as a conventional antagonist, but as an exaggerated symbol. Glittering armor, a towering curled hairstyle, a shouting entourage, an ostentatious swagger. Shonuff was not merely big, but so big that he seemed to deliberately challenge seriousness itself. He did not seek to look real. He sought to be remembered. In a genre where kung fu is often associated with restraint and discipline, Shonuff was a shock. He shouted the title Shogun of Harlem with undisguised pride, turning every appearance into a performance. For some viewers, this was a highlight, a rare villain who was both intimidating and entertaining. But for others, Shonuff seemed too excessive to be taken seriously, too flamboyant to register as a genuine threat. From the very beginning, the character stood on a fragile line between myth and exaggeration. That very choice exposed The Last Dragon's greatest risk: being misunderstood. The film does not mock martial arts. It mythologizes the martial way in its own fashion through music color and amplification. But when audiences were not prepared for this mode of storytelling, it was easy to read it as a joke, or worse, as a product that did not know what it was. What the filmmakers viewed as a street-level martial arts fairy tale, viewers could interpret as an awkward hybrid. Critics faced a similar dilemma. For writers accustomed to judging films by established genre standards, The Last Dragon was an oddity. It was not hard enough to be considered a serious action film, nor was it satirical enough to be classified as pure comedy. The innocence of the protagonist, the flamboyance of the villain, and the sudden musical moments were easily interpreted as a lack of depth rather than as deliberate stylistic choices. The risk of being dismissed came not from production quality, but from an aesthetic misalignment. At the time of its release, this was a very real danger. A film that did not fit neatly into any drawer could easily be abandoned amid more familiar options. If audiences did not understand it, they would not return. If critics did not know where to praise it, they would choose skepticism instead. The Last Dragon stood on the brink of becoming one of those films that no one strongly hated, but no one fully defended either. Surviving in the in-between. When The Last Dragon officially reached theaters in 1985, there were no ceremonial drum rolls, no sense of an event filling the auditorium. The film emerged into the light in a state that perfectly mirrored its own nature in between. Not rejected, yet not embraced. Not a disastrous failure, but far from exploding as a box office phenomenon. For a project that had carried so much risk from the very beginning, simply being released intact was already a quiet victory. The opening box office numbers for The Last Dragon were modest. They did not produce figures that made Hollywood sit up in alarm, but neither did they fall into the danger zone. In the context of the 1980s, when action films were measured by muscle and musicals required recognizable star faces, a hybrid martial arts, hip-hop film centered on a 19-year-old unknown managing to recoup its budget and turn a small profit was enough to prove that it was not entirely misguided. The film was not pulled from theaters early. It was given time to breathe, something not every odd project was afforded. Critical response unfolded exactly as the filmmakers had feared, divided. Some saw freshness in the genre-blending approach, praising the film for its energy, identity, and spirit that set it apart from formulaic kung fu movies. But there was no shortage of voices that seemed confused, even dismissive. They called the film naive, over the top, unsure of what it wanted to be. Some reviews labeled Shonuff an excessively flamboyant villain, The Glow a detail difficult to take seriously, and Bruce Leroy a protagonist lacking the sharpness expected of action heroes at the time. The danger did not lie in the criticism itself. It lay in the sense that The Last Dragon was not clearly defined enough to be defended. It did not provoke outrage strong enough to become a focal point of debate, nor was it exceptional by familiar standards to be widely celebrated. In the Hollywood ecosystem, this is the condition most likely to consign a film to rapid oblivion, not hated enough to be remembered, and not loved early enough to be protected. But The Last Dragon did not die that way. It endured, quietly, persistently. Screenings continued. Younger audiences began to return not because of critical praise, but because of the distinct feeling the film offered. For them, it was not a work that needed to be properly understood. It only needed to be felt. Motown music played. Harlem glowed on screen. A black young man bowed his head and practiced the martial way with an almost classical seriousness. These elements reached a group of viewers that review scores could never fully capture. More importantly, The Last Dragon was not buried alive. There was no decision to cut losses, no statement acknowledging failure, no attempt to hide it away as a mistake. The film was allowed to remain, and in cinema, being allowed to remain can sometimes matter more than being praised. Time became its only true ally. At this stage, no one was calling The Last Dragon a cult classic. There were no nostalgic essays yet, no generations of fans passing around quoted lines. But the film had crossed the most dangerous threshold. It was not removed from the game. It lived long enough to wait for the moment when audiences would discover it in their own way. And it was precisely in that in-between state, neither blockbuster nor disaster, that The Last Dragon began accumulating something the box office could not measure: personal attachment. Viewers watched it, not because of marketing, not because of awards, but because they found within it something they had not seen elsewhere. The film had not exploded, but it had survived. And sometimes in the history of cinema, survival is the very first step toward legend. A quiet victory. If judged only on the surface, The Last Dragon never looked like a victory story. It had no shocking opening numbers, no box office records, and it never appeared on Best Films of the Year lists. But once the dust of expectation settled, a clearer truth emerged. This film did win quietly and enduringly. With a production budget of around $10 million USD, The Last Dragon concluded its theatrical run with an estimated global gross of approximately $33 million USD. In the context of the 1980s, this was not a figure that forced Hollywood to rethink its strategies, but it was a result difficult to dismiss. The film was profitable, and comfortably so. For a project carrying so many risks, an unknown lead actor, a hybrid genre difficult to market, and a narrative tone unlike anything else earning more than 3 times its budget, was a clear affirmation that the film stood firmly on its own feet. That victory became even more evident when viewed through the lens of music. If the box office was where The Last Dragon survived, the soundtrack was where it truly ignited. Rhythm of the Night, performed by DeBarge, was more than background music. It became a phenomenon. The song climbed into the top 3 of the Billboard Hot 100, echoing across radio stations, cassette shops, dance floors, and music television. For many audiences, they heard Rhythm of the Night before they remembered Bruce Leroy, and then traced their way back to the film as a familiar cultural fragment, The Glow. The song, tied to the protagonist's moment of transcendence, took a different path. It did not rely on charts. It became a symbol. Merely mentioning the glow no longer evoked a song, but a mental state the moment a person moves beyond doubt to fully believe in themselves. Over the decades that followed, the glow was referenced, sampled, and reimagined in hip-hop, R&B, and popular culture as a recognizable code requiring no explanation. Yet the greatest achievement of The Last Dragon did not lie in money or music. It lay in the place the film occupies within American cinema history. It stands as one of the very few American martial arts films of the 1980s to place a black protagonist at the center of the story, without turning him into a victim of social tragedy. Bruce Leroy does not emerge from extreme poverty, is not pushed into crime, and does not need to escape his fate. He simply seeks self-perfection, a narrative choice that almost ran counter to how Hollywood typically portrayed black heroes at the time. That refusal to tragicize the character was an ideological victory. It allowed black audiences, especially younger viewers, to see a different image, a hero who is calm, disciplined, philosophical, and in no need of redemption. Quietly, The Last Dragon opened up a rare space, one where martial arts were not a tool of violence and where skin color did not dictate a tragic destiny. When the VHS tape arrived, if The Last Dragon had existed only in theaters, it might have ended as a film that was fine, but strange. But the film's true fate was not decided by the box office. It was decided by VHS and cable television spaces, where audiences did not watch a movie once, but lived with it. It was here that The Last Dragon began its second life, slow but persistent, like a ritual repeated over and over. When the VHS tape appeared in rental stores, the film left the glare of critical scrutiny and stepped straight into the living rooms of young audiences. There was no longer pressure to understand it correctly, no lingering sense of being judged. People rewound the scenes they liked, skipped the parts they did not care about, watched it again and again just to hear a line of dialogue, a piece of music, or the moment Bruce Leroy stood still focused, waiting for the glow to appear. The Last Dragon did not demand total attention. It invited personal attachment. Cable television played an equally important role. Late-night airings, unannounced reruns made the film appear like a chance encounter that felt strangely familiar. For many viewers, especially those who grew up in the late 1980s and early 1990s, The Last Dragon was not a movie they chose to watch, but a movie they happened to run into again and again. And with each encounter, it etched itself deeper into memory. It was precisely in this environment that elements of the film began to detach from the plot and become independent symbols. The line, "Who's the master?" no longer needed context. Just hearing it, people knew the answer. The glow ceased to be merely the climax of a fight scene. It became a mental state, an affirmation of self-belief. The Motown music in the film was no longer just background sound. It became a familiar rhythm tied to a very personal sense of youthful triumph. Young audiences experienced The Last Dragon very differently from theatrical viewers. They did not worry about whether the film was over the top. They did not compare it to classic kung fu or American action films. They accepted it exactly as it was, a martial arts fairy tale set in the heart of the city. And it was this non-judgmental acceptance that turned The Last Dragon into a cult classic even before the term itself became widespread. A cult classic does not survive on unanimous praise. It survives on small but loyal groups of people. The Last Dragon became something passed along through memory. Do you remember this movie? Rewatch this scene. That song is from this film. The movie did not need further promotion. It reproduced itself through conversations, repeat viewings, and the imitation of moves and lines. At the time, no one declared The Last Dragon a legend. But long after the box office run had ended, while the VHS tape kept being rewound, a truth slowly emerged: this film lived far longer than its commercial life cycle. And in cinema, there is no victory more enduring than being remembered, rewatched, and loved in a deeply personal way again and again. The scene no one was ever allowed to see. After years of being rewatched and endlessly rewound on VHS, audiences began to notice certain peculiar gaps, not clear enough to confirm anything, but right enough to spark suspicion. And from there, a question emerged: did a scene once exist that was never allowed to be shown to the public? From an official documented standpoint, the answer is straightforward. There are no confirmed deleted scenes. No longer cut has been archived. No missing reels have surfaced. No director or studio has ever admitted that The Last Dragon was carved up in the editing room. If the story ended there, it should have stopped. But cinematic legends rarely obey archival logic. The rumors began quietly. Some claimed that Shonuff had originally been filmed with a higher level of violence, not just flamboyant punches, but more brutal moments that would have made the villain less performative and more genuinely threatening. Others insisted that certain coarse lines of dialogue were removed, especially during confrontations, to prevent the film from slipping into a harsher censorship category. And some attentive viewers noticed something subtler. The film seemed to be missing a few everyday moment scenes, where characters simply breathed, talked, or existed outside the martial path. There was no proof, but these rumors were not unreasonable. The Last Dragon was made under conditions where the budget was cut midway through production. The script lost 40 pages and had to be rewritten from memory. In such circumstances, the removal of certain sequences, especially scenes that did not directly push the story toward its climax, was almost inevitable. Not because they were bad, but because they no longer had a place. Censorship also cannot be ignored. Despite its innocent exterior, The Last Dragon was still a martial arts film built around direct confrontation. Push the violence just one step further, and the film could have slipped into a rating that excluded younger audiences, its most important demographic. For a project already financially fragile, no one was bold enough to gamble on a scene that was heavier than necessary. Cutting early while possible was the safest option. Then there was pacing. The Last Dragon lives on energy. It needs the story to keep moving to avoid slow passages that could throw audiences off rhythm. Everyday comedic moments, no matter how charming, are often the first sacrifices in the trimming process. Those scenes did not disappear because they were wrong, but because they did not serve the speed the film needed to survive. And from those practical decisions, something strange happened. A void was created. Audiences sensed that something was missing, but could not pinpoint exactly what. Imagination began to fill in the gaps. A cut line of dialogue became a censored moment. A shortened fight became a more violent version. A rushed transition became evidence of a vanished sequence. Over time, these theories did not need to be true to survive. They only needed to be believed. And for a film nurtured by belief as much as The Last Dragon, that felt strangely fitting. The deleted scene, whether it ever truly existed or not, became inseparable from the legend itself. Because sometimes in cinema, what is never seen is what lingers the longest in memory. A film misunderstood from the very beginning. For many years after its release, The Last Dragon carried a hard-to-shake label, naive and over the top. To many, the film looked like something so carefree that it lacked seriousness. A world where villains dressed like they had stepped out of a comic book, where light radiated from the hero's body, and where the martial way was told through funk music and neon. To eyes accustomed to ascetic kung fu or hard-edged American action, all of this seemed far too indulgent to be considered serious cinema. Yet that judgment says more about audience expectations than about the film itself. The Last Dragon never tried to become what critics were looking for. It did not seek to prove that martial arts were violent, nor did it aim to depict urban life as harsh and unforgiving. What it pursued was a completely different question. If the martial way were told as a contemporary myth, what would it look like? When revisited through the lens of racial representation, The Last Dragon's ambition becomes clearer. The 1980s were a period when black characters were rarely placed at the center of martial arts narratives. And when they were often supporting figures or burdened with heavy social tragedy. Bruce Leroy was different. He did not fight to escape, poverty, was not pushed into street violence, and did not carry historical weight on his shoulders. He was simply a hero allowed to exist without justification. It was precisely this normalization that led to the film being misunderstood. To some, the absence of collective black suffering looked like avoidance. But to later cultural scholars, it was an act of liberation. The Last Dragon allowed a black young man to enter the martial path as a personal choice, rather than as a reaction to oppression. This ran counter to many familiar tropes in American cinema, and as a result, it was easily overlooked. The film was also often accused of parodying martial arts. Shonuff was too flamboyant. The glow was too mystical. The confrontations lacked bloodshed. But this reading misses a crucial point. The Last Dragon does not mock the martial way, it mythologizes it. Instead of portraying martial arts as a sequence of lethal techniques, the film turns the martial path into a spiritual journey. Its exaggerated elements are not meant for ridicule, but to lift martial arts out of everyday realism and into the realm of symbols. In the world of The Last Dragon, the villain does not need to be real. Shonuff exists as an embodiment of the ego on display of power without control. Bruce Leroy does not defeat him through tricks or greater violence, but through inner balance. The glow is not a physical reward, but the moment the character understands who he truly is. This is the structure of myth, not of pure action cinema, because it stood between two worlds, entertainment cinema and modern myth. The Last Dragon became a victim of misalignment. It did not fit old standards, yet it arrived too early to be read by new ones. Only when time created distance did audiences begin to reread the film as an attempt to redefine the martial arts hero, rather than as a strange hybrid experiment. Diverging paths. After the spotlight. When the theater lights dimmed, The Last Dragon continued on with a life of its own. But for the people who created the film, 1985 was not the beginning of a straight road leading to glory. Instead, it was a crossroads where each person turned in a different direction, carrying with them the afterglow of a moment that would never be repeated. For Taimak, the role of Bruce Leroy was both an early peak and a long shadow. After The Last Dragon, Hollywood looked at him with curiosity, yet did not know where to place him. He was not an action star in the mold of Stallone, nor an Asian martial arts actor fitting familiar templates. Taimak did not explode into superstardom, nor did he appear continuously on the big screen. Instead, he followed a quieter path: Broadway stages, television martial arts instruction, and occasional appearances as a living symbol of the past. The irony is that Taimak never lost what made Bruce Leroy discipline and belief, but Hollywood never learned how to make use of it. He became proof of a cold reality: not every cultural icon is retained by the star system. For many, Taimak needed no further roles. He was already Bruce Leroy, and that was both enough and something that could never be repeated. If Taimak was a steady light, Julius Carry was the film's most blazing flame. Shonuff. The Shogun of Harlem transcended the bounds of a conventional villain to become a true cult symbol. The armor, the hair, the shouted lines, the stance all fused into an unmistakable image. Carey did not merely play a villain, he dominated the space whenever he appeared. After The Last Dragon, Julius Carry continued his acting career, particularly in television, taking on more varied and less flamboyant roles. But none ever surpassed the shadow of Shonuff. Strangely enough, Carey seemed to understand this. He did not resist the image, nor did he deny it. In audience memory, Shonuff was not a typecasting trap, but a declaration that a villain too could become a legend in his own way. When Julius Carry passed away in 2008, many tributes did not mention his other roles, but instead recalled Shonuff as an inseparable part of 1980s popular culture. Taking an entirely different turn was Vanity, the presence that brought the film a beauty, both sharp and fragile. At the time of The Last Dragon, Vanity was a symbol of sensuality, a star associated with music spotlights and attention. But that path did not last forever. After her peak years, Vanity gradually withdrew from the entertainment world, distancing herself from the glamorous image that had made her famous. That decision did not come from professional failure, but from a personal awakening. Vanity stepped away from the spotlight, embraced a religious life, and severed ties with a past the public continued to recall. For many viewers, this was a shock. Yet in retrospect, it was a choice deeply aligned with the spirit of The Last Dragon. True light does not necessarily belong on a stage. Vanity did not need cinema's glow. She chose her own light, even if that meant disappearing from public view. Around them were many others supporting actors, fleeting faces, people who helped bring Harlem to the screen, and then continued their lives beyond the frame. None of them ever repeated the moment of 1985, and perhaps none of them needed to. The Last Dragon was not a launchpad for a series of glittering careers. It was more like a point of convergence where many paths briefly met before separating forever. That is what makes the film's human side so distinctive. There is no story of success leading seamlessly to more success. No legend reproduced again and again. Only individuals carrying the imprint of a very specific moment. a moment in which they collectively created something that could not be recreated. The Last Dragon may live on in culture, but for those behind it, 1985 will forever be just a summer that has passed brilliant brief and never to return. The Last Dragon never needed to be proven great. It only needed to be remembered through feeling through memory and through the gaps that were never filled. Sometimes it is precisely what is never seen that allows a film to live longer than everything that appears on screen. If you're still curious about buried cinematic legends about scenes that were never allowed to be shown, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. Which film would you like us to turn over next?
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.